She was 14 years old, sitting alone in seat 24B, tears sliding silently down her face, while an entire plane full of adults watched and said nothing. Not one word. The flight attendant stood over her in the aisle, arms folded, lips curved into the kind of smile that isn't really a smile at all. It's a warning. It's a power move. It's the face of someone who has done this before and never once been told to stop. And then a phone rang. It was sitting on the tray table, right in front of that flight attendant. The screen lit up, and when she glanced down and saw the name on that screen, every drop of color left her face. Her smirk disappeared. Her arms unfolded. Her carefully constructed composure, 19 years of it, 19 years of moving through aircraft cabins like she owned every inch of them, cracked right down the middle, like ice giving way under weight it was never meant to hold. Because the name on that phone wasn't just anybody. It was a name that sold out stadiums on 4 continents. A name that had graced the cover of Time magazine 3 separate times. A name that had sat across from presidents, that had performed at inaugurations, that had walked the halls of Congress advocating for the very people this flight attendant had just spent 40 minutes humiliating. A name that owned more real power in the music industry than most CEOs would ever dream of accumulating in a lifetime. That was Amara's mother calling. And by the time that call ended, nothing about that flight, nothing about that airline, would ever be the same again. But let's go back. Because to truly understand what happened at 30,000 feet that Tuesday afternoon, you need to understand who Amara Cole is. You need to understand what she carried onto that plane, not just in her carry-on bag, not just in the carefully pressed outfit she had chosen 3 nights before and hung on her door so she could look at it every morning, but what she carried inside her. The quiet, invisible kind of weight that only certain children know. The weight of growing up extraordinary by association and spending every single day wondering if you are enough on your own. Amara Josephine Cole was 14 years and 3 months old on the morning she walked through the departure terminal of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport entirely by herself for the very first time in her life. She had her boarding pass screenshot on her phone, checked 4 times before she even left the house. She had her backpack on both shoulders the way her mother always insisted. Not one shoulder, both, because her mother noticed things like posture and presence and the silent language of how the world reads you before you ever open your mouth. She had her favorite book tucked under her arm, a worn paperback copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God that her grandmother had mailed her for her birthday with a handwritten note tucked inside the front cover that said, simply, "This one changed my life. Let it change yours too." And she had her hair. Her hair. Let's talk about her hair, because her hair matters enormously to this story, more than you might realize yet. Amara's afro was not small. It was not the kind of natural hair that certain people find acceptable because it's contained or shaped into something that doesn't demand too much acknowledgement. It was full and round and gloriously, unapologetically large, the kind of afro that entered a room before the rest of you did, the kind that made children stare with pure, uncomplicated wonder and made certain adults shift uncomfortably in their seats, though they couldn't have told you why, or wouldn't. Her mother's personal stylist had done it the evening before their departure, oiling every coil with warm hands and real care, shaping it with the kind of patience and reverence that good hair artists bring to their work. And when Amara had looked at herself in the mirror afterward, really looked, the way you look when you're not just checking your reflection but actually meeting yourself, she had felt, just for a moment, just one brief and luminous moment, truly beautiful. She almost never felt that way. That's the thing you need to understand about Amara. Not because she wasn't beautiful, she was breathtaking, actually, with her mother's high cheekbones and her father's deep brown eyes and a smile that, when it chose to appear, lit up whatever room it entered like someone had thrown open every curtain at once. But Amara had spent too many years in too many rooms where beauty was defined very narrowly and enforced very quietly. Too many classrooms where her hair drew stares she wasn't supposed to notice. Too many comment sections beneath her mother's family photographs that she learned to scroll past quickly, her stomach already tightening before the words even fully registered. Too many auditions for the school play where she'd been told she had a lot going on, without anyone being willing to clarify what that meant. She had learned, slowly and painfully, the art of making herself smaller. pulling her shoulders in, choosing seats at the back, apologizing for things that weren't her fault, taking up less room than the universe had actually allocated to her. She was trying, on this particular morning, to unlearn all of that. She was trying to walk through that terminal like someone who belonged there, which she did, which every single person who looks like her does, which the world has spent centuries trying to make them forget. The trip itself was her grandmother's idea. Nana Ruth, her mother's mother, lived in Chicago, in the same wide-shouldered brick house on the south side where Diane Cole had grown up, where she had first sung into a hairbrush in front of a bathroom mirror and first understood that what was coming out of her throat was something the world was eventually going to need. Nana Ruth was 71 years old, sharper than anyone Amara had ever met, with opinions about everything from politics to pie crust and the particular gift of making you feel, in her presence, that you were the most important person in any room. She had called Amara 3 weeks earlier and said, quite simply, "Baby, I need you to come see me. Just you. Not your mama's people, not the security, not any of that. My granddaughter and her own 2 feet." And Amara, who loved her grandmother with a quiet ferocity that sometimes surprised even herself, had said yes before the sentence was even finished. Diane Cole. And yes, that Diane Cole. 6 Grammy Awards for World Tours, a production company, a fashion line, a foundation that had put over 3,000 Black girls through college, and a voice that music critics had spent 2 decades running out of new adjectives to describe, had not found this arrangement entirely easy. Not because she didn't trust Amara. She trusted her daughter completely, in the way you trust someone you've watched grow from something small and bewildered into someone steadier and more remarkable than you ever dared to plan for. But Diane Cole had spent the entirety of her career navigating a world that had very specific, very exhausting, very often irrational opinions about Black women who took up space, who claimed their seat, who refused to be moved, and she was acutely, achingly aware that her 14-year-old daughter was about to step into that same world for the first time, without her standing beside her. So she had done everything a mother could do from the outside. She had called the airline directly to register Amara as an unaccompanied minor and confirm every detail of the process. She had ensured the paperwork was flawless, the seat assignment confirmed, the boarding procedure clear. She had packed Amara a small bag of her favorite snacks, the plantain chips from the Caribbean store 2 blocks from their house, the dark chocolate with sea salt, the green apple slices in a little container that Amara pretended to be too old for, but always finished first. She had written her a note, a real note, on actual paper, in her large looping handwriting, folded into careful quarters, and slipped it into the front pocket of Amara's backpack with instructions not to read it until she was in the air. And then she had stood at the security line and hugged her daughter for a long time. She had smoothed one hand over that beautiful, enormous, magnificent afro and looked at her child and whispered, "You are everything, baby. Don't you ever forget it." And she had watched Amara walk through the security gate with her backpack on both shoulders and her book under her arm and her boarding pass ready, and she had kept watching until she couldn't see her anymore. Amara had cried a little, just past the security checkpoint. She wiped her eyes before she reached the gate. "Now, before we go any further, I need you to do something. I need you to pause, just for a second, and put yourself in this girl's shoes. 14 years old. First time flying alone. Carrying all that quiet hope and all that carefully managed insecurity, with a mother's handwritten note folded in your pocket that you haven't opened yet. You've done everything right. You've checked everything twice. You have your seat, your ticket, your paperwork. You have worked up the courage to do this hard thing, and you are doing it." And then someone in a position of authority, someone in a uniform, someone whose entire job is to make you safe and comfortable, decides, in the first 30 seconds of seeing you, that you are a problem. What do? Drop your answer in the comments. Because what Amara did is going to matter more than you can possibly imagine right now. The flight was Skybridge Airlines, Flight 447, Atlanta to Chicago O'Hare, scheduled departure 10:45 in the morning. The aircraft was a standard narrow body, 3 seats on each side, 30 rows deep, smelling of recycled air and that particular brand of stale coffee that airports manufacture specifically to make you feel like time has stopped and the outside world is a rumor. Amara found her row easily. 24B. She slid her backpack into the overhead compartment with care, settled into her seat, tucked her book in her lap, put her earphones in, and exhaled.
She was doing this.
She was actually genuinely doing this. She did not notice Linda Marsh until Linda Marsh noticed her. Linda was 46 years old and had been a flight attendant with Skybridge Airlines for 19 years, long enough to have developed a set of habits that had never once been professionally challenged, long enough for certain assumptions to harden from inclination into something she mistook for instinct. She was, on the surface, impeccable. Uniform always pressed without a crease. Hair always pinned without a strand out of place. Lipstick, a particular shade of coral she had worn for so long it had become something close to a second skin. Always precise. She moved through the cabin with the practiced confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times and intended to do it 1,000 more, and she had the kind of professional warmth that passengers tended to read as genuine because they were in a narrow metal tube at altitude and needed to believe that the person in charge of their comfort was, at baseline, a decent human being. Most of the time, that warmth was real enough. Linda was good at her job in the technical sense. She knew safety procedures cold. She could de-escalate a nervous flyer with 3 sentences and a steady hand on the armrest. She never lost luggage tags, never mixed up meal orders, never failed to smile at the right moments. But Linda Marsh also had a map in her head, an invisible, unexamined map of who belonged where and who didn't, of who warranted the full warmth and who warranted the version of warmth that was really just management. And that map had been drawn a long time ago, in the particular ink of a particular kind of upbringing, and she had never once been asked to look at it directly. She spotted Amara during boarding. Or more precisely, she spotted Amara's hair. And something shifted behind her eyes. It was subtle. The kind of shift you'd miss if you weren't watching carefully. But Marcus Webb was watching carefully. Marcus was 15 years old, assigned to seat 24A, the window seat right beside Amara, on his way to Chicago to spend spring break with his father. He was a quiet, observant kid, the kind of teenager who notices things that adults assume teenagers miss. He'd seen that look before. Not on Linda specifically, on other faces in other places. That particular recalibration that happened behind someone's eyes when they processed a presence they'd already decided was inconvenient. He knew what it meant. He just didn't know yet how badly it was about to play out. Amara had her earphones in. She didn't see any of it. Linda completed her boarding checks and returned down the aisle. She stopped at row 24. She looked at Amara. Then she looked, very deliberately, with the manner of someone performing a thorough inspection, at the seat headrest. Then back at Amara's hair. She tilted her head slightly, the way someone does when they've identified a problem they feel entirely entitled to solve. "Excuse me." Her voice was bright and carrying. The couple in row 23 both looked up. "Are you in the right seat?" Amara pulled out one earphone. "Sorry. Your seat," Linda said, slower this time, with a particular cadence of someone who has decided that repetition is a form of generosity. "Are you sure you're in the correct seat? I need to see your boarding pass." Amara blinked. She was aware, in the way you become aware at 14 when the adults around you suddenly get too quiet, that several pairs of eyes had found her. She reached into her pocket and held up her phone. Boarding pass clear as anything. Seat 24B. Skybridge Airlines. Her name. Her flight. Linda looked at it for 3 full seconds longer than she needed to. Then she made a sound, just a small sound, just a soft, dismissive and moved on down the aisle. Marcus watched her go. Then he looked at Amara. Amara was looking straight ahead, her jaw set in a way that suggested she was working very hard to keep her face arranged in a particular direction. She put her earphone back in. She opened her book. She told herself it was nothing. She had been telling herself that for years. It was a lie she was very practiced at. The plane pushed back from the gate at 10:52, 7 minutes behind schedule. The safety demonstration played. The engines climbed toward their cruising pitch, that particular sound that starts as a roar and settles into a sustained, pressurized hum, the sound of physics keeping you alive. Amara gripped the armrest during the acceleration down the runway, that involuntary, first-time response, fingers finding something solid as the ground drops away, and then released it as the wheels lifted and the plane banked left over the city. She leaned slightly across Marcus's empty armrest to look out the window, and Atlanta opened below them like a map. Roads and rooftops and the silver thread of the Chattahoochee and the small perfect grid of a neighborhood she thought she might recognize, all of it shrinking and becoming beautiful the way things sometimes do when you get enough distance. She smiled. Actually smiled, a real one, the kind that used the whole face. And then she remembered the note. She unzipped the front pocket of her backpack and took out the folded paper. Diane Cole's handwriting was unmistakable, large, looping, full of itself in the best possible way, the handwriting of someone who had long since stopped apologizing for taking up space on the page. The note said, "The sky has always belonged to dreamers. Today it belongs to you. I am so proud of you I could burst into 1,000 pieces and every single one of them would still be proud. Watch everything. Feel everything. Remember everything. And know that no matter where you go or how high you fly, my love goes higher. All of it. Always. Mom." Amara read it twice, folded it back into its quarters, held it in her hand for a while. She was still holding it when Linda Marsh came down the aisle with the drinks trolley. The service was smooth and pleasant for every row it touched before row 24. Linda smiled at the couple in 23. Asked them what they'd like. Handed over their drinks with a napkin each and a warm, professional ease that looked, from a distance, like genuine hospitality. Then she moved the trolley forward 1 row. She looked at Marcus first. "And what can I get for you, sweetheart?" Marcus asked for orange juice. He received it in under 10 seconds, with a smile. Then Linda looked at Amara. She didn't ask what she'd like. She looked, and the looking lasted just a beat too long, and then she said, "We're going to need you to move seats." The note was still in Amara's hand. "I'm sorry. There's a weight distribution concern," Linda said, in a voice that was perfectly modulated to sound like a reasonable policy explanation. "We need to rebalance the cabin. There's an available seat toward the rear." Amara was 14, not 4. She was quiet, yes. She was self-conscious, yes. She had spent years compressing herself into shapes that made other people comfortable, yes. But she had also grown up watching Diane Cole move through the world, and one of the most powerful things her mother had ever modeled, without ever explicitly teaching it, just by doing it day after day in 1,000 different rooms, was this: you do not move from your seat when your seat is yours. "I'm not moving," Amara said. Quietly. Precisely. "This is my assigned seat." Linda's smile stayed exactly where it was, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had faltered. "This isn't a discussion." "I know," Amara said, "because I'm not moving." The couple in row 23 had fully stopped pretending to read their magazines. Marcus, in 24A, had gone very still. 3 rows back, a man in a business suit had looked up from his laptop and was watching over the screen with an expression of careful attention. And then Linda leaned in, just slightly, just enough to make the conversation feel private when it was anything but, and said, in a lowered voice that somehow carried with perfect clarity to everyone within 4 rows, "I'm going to be honest with you. There have been some concerns raised by other passengers. About space. About your hair, specifically, and the headrest. Hygiene is something we take very seriously on this aircraft." The word landed the way a slap lands, not just the impact, but the silence that follows it. Amara did not flinch. She did not look away. But something shifted in her eyes, something dimmed, the way a light flickers when the power stutters, just for a moment, just long enough to remind you how dependent you are on it, and Marcus saw it happen, and something inside him went cold, and then hot in rapid succession. "My hair," Amara said, slowly, as if she were turning each word over, examining it, making sure she had heard correctly. "You want me to move because of my hair." "I want you to cooperate," Linda said, straightening up, her smile clicking back into its professional position like a latch. "For the comfort of everyone on board. Now, I need you to sit with what just happened, because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad day leaking into a poor choice of words. This was a grown woman, in a uniform, in a position of authority, legally and professionally responsible for the dignity and safety of every person on that aircraft, looking at a 14-year-old child traveling alone for the first time and telling her that her natural hair was a hygiene concern. That her afro, the same afro shaped with love by her mother's stylist the night before, the same hair Amara had looked at in the mirror and, for one small and precious moment, felt beautiful inside, was something that needed to be moved to the back. Managed. Hidden away where it would be less of an inconvenience to the comfort of people who hadn't been asked to name one single specific thing that was actually wrong. This is the part where I need you to hit that subscribe button right now if you haven't already, because what the story becomes, what Amara becomes in the next hour, is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to tell. And we're nowhere near done. Amara did not move. She sat in seat 24B, her back straight, her mother's note still folded in her hand, and she looked out the window at the clouds spreading beneath them like a second earth, and she thought about what was written on that piece of paper. The sky has always belonged to dreamers. And she thought, this sky is mine too. This seat is mine. This space is mine. And I am not moving. Then she reached into her pocket and took out her phone. Linda, already pushing the trolley forward, didn't notice. But Marcus noticed. He watched Amara's thumbs move across the screen. He watched her type. He watched her press send. And then, because he had made a quiet decision of his own somewhere in the last 5 minutes, one of those decisions that 15-year-olds make that are more morally sophisticated than most adults give them credit for, he reached into his own pocket. Neither of them said a word to each other. At 30,000 feet, two teenagers were setting things in motion that a flight attendant with 19 years of confidence and zero accountability had absolutely no way of anticipating. Not yet. But she would find out. That much was already certain. What happened next didn't happen all at once. It built. The way storms build, not from a single dramatic event but from a series of smaller pressures accumulating until the atmosphere simply cannot hold them anymore. Linda Marsh, having failed to relocate Amara to the back of the plane, regrouped in the way that people who are accustomed to having their authority go unchallenged tend to regroup. She didn't retreat, she escalated. Just more quietly. Just with more plausible deniability wrapped around each move. The meal service came next. Skybridge Flight 447 was offering a warm meal on this route, a chicken option and a pasta option, standard economy fare, the kind of food that exists mainly to give passengers something to do with their hands for 20 minutes. The flight attendants worked their way down the aisle efficiently. Linda reached row 24, handed Marcus his chicken without a pause, then looked at Amara and said, with that impenetrable smile, "I'm afraid you're not showing in our system as having pre-ordered a meal." Amara looked up from her book. "My mother ordered one when she booked the ticket." "I can check," Linda said pleasantly, in a tone that communicated she had already checked and the matter was settled. "But I'm not showing anything. You're welcome to purchase something from the snack cart later." "I have confirmation," Amara said. "I can show you the email." "That won't be necessary," Linda said and moved on. Marcus stared at his chicken. Then he looked at Amara. "You want half of this?" Amara shook her head. She wasn't hungry anymore anyway. Her stomach had tightened into something that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite sadness, and wasn't quite fear. It was all three of them pressed together, which is a specific kind of feeling that many people in this story's audience will recognize without needing it explained. She opened the bag of plantain chips her mother had packed. She ate them slowly, staring out the window. In the row ahead, the couple in 23 had stopped being subtle about watching. The woman, who would later identify herself, in a statement to the Airline's complaint department, as Patricia Okafor, a pediatric nurse from Evanston, was watching Linda's movements up and down the aisle with an expression that had moved well past discomfort and into something closer to fury. Her husband had his hand on her arm in a way that suggested he was asking her to wait, to see how things developed, to give it a moment before she acted. She was giving it a moment, but only just. Linda made 2 more passes down the aisle in the next 30 minutes. Both times she paused at row 24. The first time, she told Amara that she'd received another passenger complaint about the overhead compartment being overfull due to Amara's bag, a claim that was visually, demonstrably false, as Marcus could see perfectly clearly that there was 6 inches of space on either side of Amara's backpack. The second time, she stood in the aisle for a moment, looked deliberately and openly at the headrest behind Amara's hair, and then produced a small spray bottle and spritzed something in the vicinity of the seat, not touching Amara, but close enough to make the gesture unmistakable. Unmistakable and deliberate, and humiliating in the specific way that things are humiliating when they're designed to be deniable. Amara held her book open in her lap and did not look up, but her hands were shaking. Not with fear. Let's be clear about that. Not with the trembling uncertainty of someone who doesn't know what's being done to them. Amara knew exactly what was being done to her. She had the vocabulary for it. She had grown up in a household where these things were named and discussed, and not permitted to live in the shadows where they do their worst damage. Her mother had taught her the language of what was happening, the clinical terms and the lived terms, the formal ones and the kitchen table ones. She knew what this was. Her hands were shaking because she was holding herself together by sheer force of will, and 14 years of living does not yet give you all the tools you need to do that completely silently. She was winning, but it was costing her. Anyone who has ever had to sit very still while someone did something unjust to them in public will understand exactly what that costs. Marcus Webb understood it too. He had been watching the entire sequence with the focused, quiet attention of someone who knows that what they are seeing matters, that it is the kind of thing that, if not witnessed and documented, will be denied and erased later. He was thinking about his best friend Darius, back home in Atlanta. He was thinking about the things Darius had described happening to him in stores, in schools, in the particular spaces where authority wore a uniform. He was thinking about how Darius always said, "Nobody ever sees it. Or if they do, they look away." He was thinking, "I am not looking away." He had been recording on his phone for 22 minutes. He didn't tell Amara. Not yet. He didn't want to disturb whatever she was building inside herself, that careful, costly stillness. But the recording was running, capturing Linda's movements, her expressions, the spray bottle, the meal denial, all of it. Clear and unambiguous, time-stamped and irrefutable. Meanwhile, 3,000 feet below cruising altitude and approximately 700 miles to the northeast, in a sold-out arena in Chicago where Skybridge Flight 447 was scheduled to land in approximately 90 minutes, something was happening that Linda Marsh could not possibly have anticipated, because it required knowing who Amara's mother actually was, which Linda did not know, had not known, had not thought to find out, because in Linda's mental map of the world, the girl in seat 24B was not someone whose people you needed to worry about. She was simply someone to be managed, redirected, reduced. That was the error. That was the crack in the foundation that everything else would eventually fall through. Diane Cole was in the middle of a soundcheck. She was standing at the center of a stage large enough to park 4 school buses in an arena that seated 22,000 people, wearing a rehearsal outfit and earpieces and the particular expression of focused concentration she wore during technical run-throughs, the expression that her tour manager described privately as the face that means "don't talk to me" unless the building is literally on fire. Her band was running through the bridge of her opening number. The lighting team was adjusting the follow spots. Everything was on schedule for the evening's show. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't look at it. She had a rule during soundchecks: phone off or face down, exceptions for emergencies only. But something made her glance at the screen. Maybe it was the particular way it buzzed, 3 short pulses in a row, the pattern she'd set specifically for Amara's messages, so they'd always cut through whatever else was happening. She looked. There were 6 messages. They had come in over the last 30 minutes, each one slightly more compressed than the last, the way messages get when someone is trying to keep their feelings from overtaking their words. The first one said, "Hey Mom, on the plane. It's nice up here." The second one said, "So there's this flight attendant. She asked me to move seats and said something about my hair and hygiene. I said no." The third one said, "She just took away my meal, or said I didn't have one. I have the confirmation email, but she said it doesn't matter." The fourth one said, "She just sprayed something near my seat, like near my hair. Mom, I don't want to make a big deal of it, but it feels like a big deal." The fifth one said, "I'm okay. Just wanted you to know. Don't be mad." The sixth one said, "Actually, you can be mad." Diane Cole read all 6 messages in approximately 20 seconds. Then she stood very still on that stage for a moment, which was the kind of stillness that her band knew to pay attention to, because it was not the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of someone who had processed something and was now deciding what to do about it, and the deciding was going fast. She stepped away from the microphone. She looked at her tour manager, Derek, who was already walking toward her because he had seen the stillness and knew what it meant. She held up one finger, "Give me a minute," and walked to the edge of the stage. She called Amara first. The call didn't connect. Amara was in flight, and the in-flight Wi-Fi on Skybridge 447 was, it turned out, not robust enough for voice calls. Diane texted back, "I see everything you wrote. I need you to stay exactly where you are in exactly your seat, and know that I am handling this right now. You are not alone. I love you. Stay." Then she made a second call. The person she called was not a lawyer, though lawyers would be involved soon enough. It was not a publicist, though publicists would be mobilized within the hour. The person she called was a man named Gerald Whitmore, and Gerald Whitmore was, among other things, a majority shareholder in Skybridge Airline's parent company, and he had been Diane Cole's label's primary investor for 11 years, and the two of them had a relationship built on the particular foundation of people who have made each other significant amounts of money, while also genuinely respecting each other's work. Gerald answered on the second ring. "Diane." His voice was warm, unhurried, the voice of a man who receives important calls at all hours and has learned to seem unsurprised by all of them. "You're supposed to be in soundcheck." "I am," she said. "And I'm about to tell you something that's going to need your attention before my daughter's plane lands in Chicago in about 90 minutes. Gerald Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "Then, tell me." She told him. The call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. When it ended, Diane Cole walked back to the center of the stage, put her earpieces back in, and nodded to her band director to take it from the top. Because the show was in 6 hours, and the show had never once not happened. But her jaw was set in a way that her band director recognized, had seen before on stages in 7 countries, had seen in green rooms and hotel lobbies, and once in the back of a car after a particularly ugly review, and he made a small, quiet decision of his own, which was to make sure the soundcheck ran perfectly and that nobody said anything unnecessary to Diane Cole in the next 90 minutes. Back on Flight 447, Amara had read her mother's response. She had read it 3 times.
"Stay.
"I am handling this. You are not alone." She breathed. She straightened her spine. She looked out the window at the clouds, and she did something she had not done yet on this flight. She allowed herself, very carefully, to believe that this was going to be okay. Not because she was powerless and waiting for rescue, but because she had done everything right. She had held her seat. She had spoken clearly. She had documented. She had reached out. She was 14 years old, and she had handled an unjust situation with more composure and dignity than most adults manage in a lifetime, and now the machinery of consequence was beginning to turn, and all she had to do was sit in her seat, the one she had paid for, the one she had every right to, the one she had refused to give up, and let it turn. Linda Marsh, meanwhile, was in the forward galley, describing the situation to her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Rachel, 24 years old and 6 months into the job, in terms that would have been recognizable to anyone who has ever heard authority dress up prejudice as policy. She said the girl was not cooperating with standard cabin management procedures. She said there had been multiple passenger complaints. She said the hair situation was genuinely a hygiene concern, per regulations. Rachel listened and nodded because she was new and Linda was senior, and that particular power dynamic has been doing damage in workplaces for as long as workplaces have existed. But Rachel had also been in the cabin. She had seen the meal service. She had seen the spray bottle. She had seen the expression on the face of the woman in 23A, Patricia Okafor, which was the expression of someone keeping score. Rachel was young and the job was new and the power dynamic was real, but she was not confused about what she had witnessed. She was just, in that moment, unsure what to do about it. She would figure it out. Captain Rhodes had been informed of a passenger management situation in rows 23 to 25 by Linda, who framed it as a minor disruption being handled appropriately. He was 61 years old, 2 years from retirement, a careful, experienced man who flew this route regularly and had enormous respect for his crew's ability to manage cabin dynamics without his intervention. He acknowledged the update and returned his attention to the flight. He did not go back to check on the situation himself. Not yet. He would later say, in the formal inquiry that followed, that this was the decision he most regretted. That he should have walked back there the moment the word passenger was followed by anything other than a routine description. He would say it with the specific, heavy candor of someone who has spent a long time thinking about a thing they cannot undo. The flight was 45 minutes from Chicago when Linda made her final move. Amara had, by this point, quietly taken out her phone and begun recording the aisle in front of her, holding it at lap level, angled upward, capturing the space without being obvious about it. She had learned this from watching the documentation practices of people her mother admired, activists and journalists, and ordinary citizens who had understood that the camera was, in certain circumstances, the most powerful tool available. She wasn't broadcasting. She wasn't performing. She was just making sure there was a record. Just in case someone later said nothing happened, just in case someone shrugged and said it was a misunderstanding, just in case the world tried to do what the world so often does with the experiences of young Black girls, which is to suggest that what they clearly felt and clearly experienced and clearly documented was somehow less real than someone else's comfort. Linda came down the aisle with a form. "I'm going to need you to fill this out," she said, placing it on Amara's tray table. "It's a passenger conduct form. There have been multiple complaints, and I'm required to document this." Amara looked at the form. Then she looked at Linda. "I haven't done anything." "The form is standard procedure," Linda said. "A conduct form is standard procedure," Amara repeated slowly. "For a passenger who is sitting in their assigned seat, reading a book. For a passenger who has refused repeated reasonable requests from crew," Linda said. Her voice was still smooth, still professionally modulated, but there was something else in it now, something tighter, something that suggested she had expected this to have gone differently by now, that Amara's refusal to capitulate had shifted from a minor inconvenience into something that had begun to feel, to Linda, like a personal challenge. "I'm not signing that," Amara said. "If you refuse to cooperate with crew instructions, we may be required to contact the authorities upon landing." There it was, the threat at the end of the road. The escalation that was supposed to make a 14-year-old child, alone and without immediate adult backup, decide that compliance was less frightening than confrontation. It was calculated. It was cruel. And it did not work. "Okay," Amara said, looking up at Linda with her mother's eyes. Those particular eyes, the ones that could hold a stadium of 22,000 people without flinching. "Contact whoever you need to contact. And while you're doing that, I'd like you to know that my mother is also making some contacts of her own." Linda blinked. Just once. Then the smile returned. "Your mother can contact our customer service line, of course." Amara said, with a small, specific sound that contained multitudes. And she turned back to the window. Patricia Okafor, in row 23, had her own phone out. She had been sending detailed, time-stamped notes to her husband's email for the last 30 minutes, a habit from her nursing background, the instinct to document everything real-time because in her professional experience, the accuracy of accounts degraded rapidly once an incident was officially over and everyone started managing their version of events. She had 7 pages of notes. She had the name on Linda's badge. She had the flight number, the time, the seat numbers, the verbatim wording of as many exchanges as she had been able to capture. She had been a pediatric nurse for 16 years, and she had seen children in distress in every configuration imaginable, and she knew the particular quality of the stillness that Amara was holding. The stillness of a child who is keeping themselves together through sheer determination because falling apart is not an option, and it made her furious in a way that was clean and purposeful and pointed. She pressed the call button above her seat. It was Rachel who came. Patricia looked at her name badge and said, quietly, "Rachel, I need to make a formal complaint about the treatment of the passenger in 24B. I want to do this now on the aircraft so it's documented before we land. I have notes. I have times. I have the exact language that was used. And I want this on record." She paused. I'm a nurse. I document things professionally. And I want you to know that what I have documented today is significant. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, equally quietly, I'll get you a complaint form. And then, after another moment, I'll need to fill one out myself. Patricia Okafor nodded once. Good. In 24A, Marcus had stopped recording. He had 42 minutes of footage. He uploaded it to his cloud account while the flight's Wi-Fi was still barely functional. Then he texted his father in Chicago. Dad, I have something to show you when I land. It's important. His father, who was a journalist, responded in 11 seconds with, Okay, I'm here. The plane began its descent into O'Hare. The captain announced 20 minutes to landing. The fasten seatbelt sign came on. Linda moved through the cabin in her final pre-landing sweep, and when she reached row 24, she did something that none of the surrounding passengers would ever entirely explain. Maybe it was the accumulated pressure of an hour of not getting what she'd wanted. Maybe it was the particular intractability of a 14-year-old girl who simply would not be moved. Maybe it was something uglier and older that had been waiting for the wrong moment to express itself fully. Whatever the reason, she looked at Amara and said, loudly enough for at least a dozen people to hear clearly, I hope when you get off this plane, you learn how to present yourself in a way that's appropriate for public spaces. The cabin went very quiet. Not the ambient quiet of people minding their business. The charged, stunned quiet of people who have just heard something they cannot believe was actually said out loud. Amara looked up at her. She looked at her for a long moment. And then she said, in a voice that was completely steady, completely clear, and completely devastating in its composure, I think you should save that advice for yourself. Because when this plane lands, you're going to need it a lot more than I do. She turned back to her window. Outside, Chicago was coming up through the clouds, Lake Michigan glinting to the east, the skyline rising in the gray afternoon light, the familiar, impossible geometry of a city assembling itself below the descending aircraft. Amara looked at it. She thought about Nana Ruth waiting somewhere on the other side of baggage claim, probably in her good coat, probably having argued with whoever offered to drive her about whether she could manage the airport on her own, which she absolutely could. She thought about what Nana Ruth would say when she heard this story. She thought Nana Ruth was going to say something absolutely magnificent. The wheels touched down at O'Hare at 12:31 p.m., 11 minutes behind the revised schedule. The plane taxied toward the gate. Amara picked up her book, zipped her backpack, made sure her mother's note was safely in the front pocket. Around her, passengers stood, retrieved luggage, had the small practical conversations of people transitioning from one place to another. The atmosphere was strange, thick with something unresolved, like a room after an argument that hasn't finished yet, where everyone is waiting for the next thing to happen. Linda was at the front of the cabin near the door, professional, composed, holding the handle of the aircraft exit like someone who has just completed a routine duty. The door opened, and Linda Marsh saw what was waiting on the other side, and her hand tightened on the handle, and the coral lipstick smile finally, completely, and permanently disappeared. There were airport officials. Not one, several, in skybridge uniforms, with the particular alert posture of people who have received specific instructions and are taking them seriously. There was a woman in a dark blazer whom Linda recognized, after a disoriented moment, as the Regional Operations Director for Skybridge's Midwest Hub, a woman Linda had met once at a staff conference and had not expected to see standing at a gate at O'Hare on a Tuesday afternoon, looking exactly like this. There were two people who did not wear airline uniforms and whose presence at the jet bridge made Linda's stomach drop, because they were the kind of people who carry leather portfolios and have the manner of individuals who document things professionally and are very rarely there for good reasons. And behind all of them, walking through the terminal corridor with the calm, inexorable momentum of someone who has been moving toward this moment for the last 90 minutes and arrived at it with exactly the energy she intended, was Diane Cole. She was not in her performance outfit. She was in what she had worn to soundcheck. Dark trousers, a structured jacket, her own natural hair out and full and enormous and magnificent, because Diane Cole had long since decided that her hair was never going to be the reason she made herself smaller. She was not moving fast. She didn't need to. She moved the way she moved on stages, like the space was already hers, like the question of whether she belonged there had been settled so long ago it was no longer worth revisiting. She did not look at Linda immediately. She looked down the jet bridge, past the officials and the lawyers and the operations director, and she found her daughter. Amara was stepping off the plane. Her backpack was on both shoulders. Her book was under her arm. Her afro was exactly as it had been when she boarded, full and round, and taking up exactly the space it was entitled to. Her eyes found her mother, and something happened in her face. Not the collapse of the emotion she'd been holding all flight, not the breakdown of the composure that had cost her so much, but the quiet, profound release of it. Like a door opening, like exhaling after a very long time underwater. Diane crossed the distance to her daughter in 6 strides and pulled her into an embrace that the operations director would later describe, in a personal account she shared with colleagues, as the most quietly devastating thing she'd witnessed in 11 years of managing airline incidents. She didn't say anything immediately. She just held her. One hand on Amara's back, one hand resting gently, deliberately, on her daughter's hair. On that magnificent, natural, takes up all the space it is owed afro. Holding it there. After a moment, she pulled back and looked at Amara. "Are you okay?" Amara said, "I didn't move." Diane's eyes were bright. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't." Then she straightened up. She turned. And she looked at Linda Marsh for the first time. She looked at her for a long time, without saying anything. Linda stood very still. The operations director was beside her, and one of the people with the leather portfolios was already speaking quietly to someone on a phone. The airport was doing its usual business around them. The announcements, the foot traffic, the sound of a city in perpetual motion, and in the middle of all of it, this specific silence had a shape and a weight all its own. Finally, Diane Cole said, "Do you know who I am?" Linda's mouth opened.
Closed.
"Miss Cole, I can explain."
"I didn't ask that," Diane said.
Her voice was perfectly even. "I asked if you know who I am." "Yes," Linda said. "I do." "Good," Diane said. "Because I want to be very clear that this has nothing to do with who I am." She paused. "My daughter had every right to her seat before I was anybody. She had every right to her hair before I sold one record. She had every right to her dignity before any of it, the Grammys, the stadiums, the shareholder calls. None of that is what makes her entitled to be treated like a human being. She was always entitled to that. You understand me?" Linda said nothing. "Good," Diane said again. And she put her arm around Amara's shoulders and walked down the terminal. Behind them, the operations director began speaking to Linda in the particular low, formal voice of official consequence. The 2 people with the leather portfolios were fully engaged. Marcus Webb emerged from the jet bridge with his phone clutched in one hand and found his father, a tall man with a journalist's observant eyes and a recorder already running, waiting 15 feet away, and they had a very quick, very pointed conversation before Marcus handed his phone over. Patricia Okafor came off the plane with 7 pages of notes and a very clear sense of what she intended to do with them. Rachel, the junior flight attendant, came off the plane and handed her own written incident report directly to the operations director, because she had spent the last 40 minutes of that flight deciding that 6 months was long enough to watch things happen and say nothing, and that this was the day she stopped. Captain Rhodes came through last and stood for a moment in the terminal, taking in the assembled officials and the quietly operational chaos of consequence arranging itself around the gate. He found the operations director's eye and held it for a moment, and something passed between them that was partly professional and partly something older than that, partly the acknowledgement of the thing he had let happen by not acting sooner, by trusting the wrong person's account of the situation, by staying in the cockpit when he should have walked back through the cabin. He would go on to write a formal statement. It was, by all accounts of those who read it, very honest, and honesty in those circumstances is both the minimum required and, somehow, still rare enough to be notable. Now, there is a version of this story that ends at the airport gate. Linda Marsh is terminated. A statement is issued. The news cycle picks it up for 48 hours and then moves on to the next thing. Amara gets to Chicago, hugs her grandmother, eats whatever Nana Ruth has cooked, goes home a week later. Diane Cole adds it to the long, wearying list of things that have happened to her family in spaces that were supposed to be neutral. That version would have been enough to be angry about. That version would have been enough to be sad about. That version would have been enough. But that is not the version that happened. What happened was Marcus Webb's 42 minutes of footage. His father, whose name was David Webb and who had been a journalist for 20 years, covering civil rights and criminal justice and the particular, persistent ways that ordinary authority expresses extraordinary bias, watched the footage in full on the drive from the airport. He pulled over on the expressway and watched it again from the beginning. And then he made 3 calls. The first was to his editor. The second was to a civil rights attorney he trusted. The third was to a documentary filmmaker who had been working on a project about racial bias in the service industry and who had been, for some months, waiting for a case study with footage clean enough to use. The footage was posted, with Marcus's permission and his mother's written consent obtained by phone in the first hour, to the journalist's verified social media accounts at 4:17 p.m. on the Tuesday of the flight. By 6 p.m. it had been shared 40,000 times. By 9 p.m., when Diane Cole's show was halfway through its sold-out run, it had been shared 800,000 times. By midnight it had passed 3 million. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Not just the footage. The details around it, Linda's name, her 19-year tenure at Skybridge, the specific language she had used, the meal denial, the spray bottle, the conduct form, the final comment about presenting yourself appropriately in public spaces. All of it documented. All of it time-stamped. All of it confirmed by 4 independent witnesses who were all, in their various ways, exceptionally credible. Skybridge Airlines issued their first statement at 11 p.m. on the Tuesday, the standard crisis boilerplate, the language of taking these allegations very seriously and conducting a thorough internal review and remaining committed to ensuring all passengers. By 8 a.m. on Wednesday, that statement had been ratioed into irrelevance by a combination of David Webb's journalism, Patricia Okafor's documented account, Rachel's public statement about what she had witnessed as a crew member, and Diane Cole's own statement, which she had posted at midnight, right after the show. Sitting in her dressing room with her makeup half removed and her hair down, and Amara on a video call from Nana Ruth's house in Chicago. Diane's statement was not long. Diane Cole had the gift, which is really the result of enormous discipline masquerading as a gift, of knowing exactly how many words a thing requires and not using one more. The statement said, "My daughter is 14 years old. She flew alone for the first time today. She was patient, dignified, and brave in circumstances that should never have existed. She didn't move from her seat. She held her ground. She documented what happened. She reached out for support. She handled herself with more grace than this situation deserved. I am not writing this to ask for anything. Not for an apology, not for a statement, not for a policy announcement. I am writing this so that every Black girl who reads it knows. Your hair is not a problem. Your presence is not a problem. You are not a problem. The problem has never been you. It has never been your hair." It was shared 2.4 million times in the first 12 hours. Skybridge Airline's second statement, at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, announced that Linda Marsh had been relieved of her duties pending the conclusion of a full investigation. By the close of business on Wednesday, full investigation had been upgraded to terminated, effective immediately, following the release of Rachel's account and the confirmation by the operations director that Linda had made misrepresentations to Captain Rhodes about the nature of the cabin situation. But the story was larger than Linda Marsh by then. Much larger. What the footage and the documentation and Diane Cole's statement collectively produced was not just a viral news cycle, it was a moment. One of those moments where something that many people knew privately and had lived personally and had described repeatedly in spaces where no one with institutional power was listening suddenly broke into a space that could not be ignored. The testimony of Black women and girls about their hair, about the specific, documented, persistent ways that natural Black hair was policed in schools, workplaces, hospitals, courtrooms, and yes, aircraft cabins had been accumulating for years. Decades. There was research. There were reports. There were the testimonies of millions of individual women and girls who had been told, in varying degrees of directness and cruelty, that the hair that grew out of their heads was inappropriate, unhygienic, unprofessional, excessive, or just generally too much. They had been saying this for years. Now there was footage. And a Grammy-winning mother. And a 14-year-old girl who had not moved from her seat. The congressional hearing was requested within a week. It was not specifically about Skybridge Airlines or Linda Marsh. It was about the broader question of civil rights enforcement in public transportation and the service industry, with a particular focus on documented incidents of discrimination on the basis of race and physical characteristics. It was the third such hearing to be called in 5 years. But this time, the footage existed. This time, the documentation was ironclad. This time, a nurse's 7 pages of notes sat in a congressional record next to a flight attendant's own incident report next to 42 minutes of video shot by a 15-year-old boy who had simply decided not to look away. Gerald Whitmore, the majority shareholder Diane had called from the soundcheck stage, announced that Skybridge's parent company would be partnering with a civil rights organization to develop and implement a mandatory bias training program across all airline staff, from crew to management to airport operations. He made this announcement at a press conference at which he did not mention Diane Cole by name because he understood, as people in his position understand, that the story was not about her. He did mention Amara. He said her name. He said it was important that her name be in this record. Amara was in Chicago when she found out about the congressional hearing. She was sitting in Nana Ruth's kitchen, the kitchen with the yellow curtains and the smell of something always either just finished cooking or about to start, the kitchen where her mother had grown up singing into hairbrushes, eating Nana Ruth's jollof rice, which was, Amara firmly believed, the best jollof rice in the world, and a fact that was simply not available for debate. Nana Ruth had read everything. All of it. The statements, the journalism, the footage, the congressional request. She had read it with her reading glasses on and her tea going cold beside her, and the expression of someone who has lived long enough to have seen many things and remains, despite this, capable of being moved by them. When she looked up from her phone, she looked at Amara for a long moment. "Baby," she said, "I want you to tell me the whole story from the beginning. Not the version online. Your version. Everything you felt." And Amara told her. She told her about the check-in and the note, and the sound of the wheels leaving the ground, and how beautiful Atlanta had looked from above. She told her about Linda's eyes at boarding, and the boarding pass check, and the meal denial, and the spray bottle, and the conduct form, and the last comment in the aisle before landing, and how her hands had shaken but she had not moved. She told her about reading her mother's note, and deciding that the sky was hers too. She told her about reaching into her pocket and texting her mother and how it had felt, not like calling for rescue but like making sure someone knew where she was. Nana Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting, which was, from Nana Ruth, the highest form of love. When Amara finished, Nana Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over Amara's and she said, "You know what your grandmother's grandmother would have said to you right now?" Amara shook her head. She would have said, "Baby, you come from a long line of women who didn't move." She would have said, "Every one of them was told, in some way or another, to sit at the back or get to the back or get out of the way. And not one of them did. And you didn't either." She squeezed Amara's hand. "You are the line continuing. You understand me?" Amara understood. She understood it differently than she had understood anything before, not as a lesson received but as a truth recognized. The way you recognize something that was always true about yourself and just needed the right moment to become visible. She was the line continuing. She was 14 years old, and she had flown alone for the first time, and she had been targeted, and she had held her seat, and she had reached for support, and she had sat still in her dignity and let consequence find the right people, and all of that was hers now. All of that was woven into her. Nobody could take it out. She went home a week later, as planned. Her mother met her at the Atlanta airport, and this time there was no security line between them, just arrivals, and Diane Cole was there in person at the gate because she had called ahead and because she was Diane Cole, and because sometimes using your power means using it to simply be where your child arrives. She held Amara for a long time. Then she held her at arm's length and looked at her hair. "Beautiful," she said. Just that. Just the one word. But the way she said it made it sound like something that had been said by every woman in their line, all the way back to the beginning, like she was not just saying it herself, but transmitting it, passing it through Amara like a current, making sure it reached everywhere it needed to go. Amara smiled, the whole face kind. The press conference happened 3 weeks later. Skybridge Airlines held it at their corporate headquarters, flanked by their newly appointed diversity and equity officers, and a statement that had been drafted, revised, and drafted again over the course of 72 hours. Linda Marsh did not attend, for obvious reasons. The investigation had confirmed what the documentation showed, what the witnesses described, what Rachel's own account detailed, that the targeting of Amara had been deliberate, escalating, and consistent with a pattern of behavior that the airline's internal records, once subpoenaed, suggested was not entirely new. Diane Cole did not attend the press conference. She issued a brief statement through her team that said simply, "My daughter and I are watching with interest. We will be more interested in what comes next than in what is being said today." This was widely interpreted as a warning.
It was intended as one.
The airline announced a full review of cabin crew training across all routes. They announced the creation of a passenger advocacy office. They announced a $5 million partnership with a civil rights foundation, not Diane Cole's foundation, pointedly because that would have looked like payment and felt like silence buying. They named Amara in the press release. They spelled her name correctly on the first try, which her mother noted privately and without magnanimity, because you should be able to get someone's name right the first time, and the fact that institutions often cannot is one more thing in the category of things that compound. Marcus Webb's footage was eventually used in 2 separate documentaries, both of which featured Marcus himself, who turned out to be a naturally gifted on-camera interviewee with a particular kind of steady, specific intelligence that makes journalists want to quote you. He gave a short speech about it at his school in Atlanta, which his principal said was the most attentive an assembly audience had been in 4 years. His best friend Darius was in the front row. Rachel, the junior flight attendant, was commended internally for her incident report and went on to become involved in the airline's newly formed Crew Standards Committee, where she spent the next several years contributing to the very training program her former senior colleagues' behavior had made necessary. She would describe this later as the strangest way to make your job mean something, but I'll take it. Patricia Okafor's 7 pages of notes were entered into the formal record of the congressional hearing and were cited, specifically, in the committee's final recommendations.
She was asked to testify.
She brought her notes, printed, organized, dated, and answered every question with the precision of someone who has spent 16 years in healthcare, understanding that the record is never just the record. It is the thing that decides who gets believed when no one is watching. Captain Rhodes testified too. He told the truth. He said what he had seen, what he had been told, what he had and had not done, and the specific weight of that final category. The committee thanked him. He did not seem comforted by the thanks, which probably meant he understood something important about the difference between accountability and absolution. And Amara. Amara went back to school the week after she returned from Chicago. She went back to the same school where she had spent years making herself smaller, where she had pulled her shoulders in and chosen the back seats and apologized for taking up room. She went back with her afro, freshly done, full and round and glorious, and she walked in through the front door, and she went to her locker, and she went to her first class, and she sat in the middle of the room. Not the back. The middle.
She didn't announce it.
She didn't explain it. She just sat there in the middle of the room, in the middle of the space that had always been hers to claim, and she opened her notebook, and she started to write. She had decided she wanted to tell stories. Not about herself, necessarily, or not only about herself. About people who held their seat. About people who were told to move, and didn't. About people who reached into their pockets in the middle of injustice and texted someone, not from weakness, but from the wisdom of knowing you don't have to face things alone. She had read enough of their eyes were watching God during that flight, tucked between the moments of holding herself together, to know that there was something sacred in the telling of certain truths, and that the telling was itself an act of staying. She would grow up to be good at it. But that's a story for another time. For now, for this Tuesday, for this flight, for this particular stretch of 30,000 feet where a 14-year-old girl sat in her assigned seat and refused to be moved, this is what she was. She was her mother's daughter. She was Nana Ruth's granddaughter. She was the line continuing. She was a girl with a magnificent afro and a paperback novel and a mother's handwritten note folded into her pocket that said the sky belongs to dreamers, and she had looked out that window at the clouds and decided, with the quiet finality of someone who will not be revisiting the decision, that it belonged to her too.
It did.
It always had. And no one, no uniform, no smirk, no spray bottle, no conduct form, no carefully modulated voice delivering manufactured policy, had ever actually had the power to change that. They had only ever had the power to make her believe otherwise. She had refused to believe it. That is, in the end, the whole story. Not the shareholder call, not the press conference, not the 42 minutes of footage, not the congressional record. Those are the consequences. The story is a 14-year-old girl on a plane, alone for the first time, who was told she was too much, and who looked out the window at everything below her and thought, no. The story is the no. The story is always the no. If something in this story moved you, if Amara's quiet courage reminded you of someone, if Linda's quiet cruelty reminded you of something, if Nana Ruth's kitchen and the yellow curtains and the jollof rice and the things she said about the women who didn't move made something settle in your chest, then you already understand why this channel exists. Black Lens is here because these stories deserve to be told in full. Not summarized, not clipped, not reduced to a headline or a moment of outrage that the algorithm surfaces and then buries. Told in full, with the weight they carry and the people they contain and the complicated, costly, extraordinary grace that moves through them.
Subscribe.
Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the people who tried to make you believe you were too much, they were wrong. They have always been wrong. The only thing you were ever too much of was yourself. And that, as it turns out, is exactly the right amount. The sky belongs to dreamers. Always has. A Black Lens original production.